All right. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. See some people already in the chat. If you're coming in, go ahead and. Sorry. See, every time. See some people already in the chat. I gotta get better at that one day.
Hey, it's part of it, right, brother? It's part of it. I do this I do way more mistakes than you do. Okay, so just so everyone knows, that's why I don't do lives as much or ever really, because I'm not sure I can master the technology yet. So I give you all the credit, dude.
Hey, I'm trying.
Yeah, it's good.
All right. So if this is your first time here, make sure and subscribe. Make sure you hit the notification bell so you never miss a video or an interview with a guest such as I have tonight. I am excited to be joined again by my trainer slash mentor to a degree in apologetics, Jim Warner Wallace.
I appreciate you, brother. I'm glad to be
Yes,
here. Yeah,
absolutely.
it's awesome.
I'll let you introduce yourself and just kind of, for those that don't know, just kind of your background and.
Well, I mean, there's not. I mean, I've worked at cold case homicides for years here in Los Angeles County. I think it's probably most what people know me for. Either they watch the old Dateline episodes that I've been on, or kind of watch my talks where I talk about applying this skill set to the Christian worldview. So that's probably what I'm known for most. And I appreciate having me. We got to know each other through Frank Turek, who's going to end up, when this is all over, probably will end up being like remembered as such a great facilitator, right? Because he's put together all of us so many times in training sessions of one kind or another where we get to know each other, that we're going to look back at that time and go, wow, that was a really cool window in which the kingdom was advanced probably by all that work. So pretty cool.
Absolutely. And so I was talking with Alyssa. She was on maybe a few months ago. And we were thinking back to that 2016. It's almost like your graduating class.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah.
But
You think about like what group were you in, right? And he does about what, 60 a year or so. And to think about doing that for 10 years, that's 600 people, or at least some percentage of 600, because a lot of us repeat. But that who have got a chance to kind of just hang out and talk about the evidence for Christianity and the culture and how to best impact the culture. And we're all really indebted to Frank.
Absolutely. I mean, in that class, I think Natasha was in there. Alyssa was in there.
Yeah.
And this is before they became these household names, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
And what we all knew though, too, that, I mean, I knew it, you probably knew it too, as I was watching these folks for the first time. I remember thinking, yeah, there's this person's like God anointed, you know, like you don't have to do much to help them do this well. They already do it well. And so, yeah, it's been great.
Absolutely. Well, I am excited to have you back again. And so for those that don't know, let me see if I can find a picture here. Jim has a new book out.
There it is.
Called Person of Interest. I read it. So I'm just going to jump right in because one of the things I love, it's cool when you get to talk behind the scenes, pretty much with people of any profession when they're in their lane, so to speak. But to get a window into like the real detective mind, not the TV show Law and Order stuff, but you know, that case that you track through the book while you're also explaining why Jesus is a person of interest. It's a cool parallel that you were able to do there, and only you could do it because I don't know.
Well, and a lot of it too. I think that's probably. I mean, we started doing that with kids' books, right? Where we were talking about cases or mysteries, and then trying to help students take the mystery, whatever they learned in the mystery, and apply it to Christianity. And so I thought and parents would read those books and they would write to me and say, wow, that was really a hard book to put down. And I'm thinking, this is not. I mean, remember Hardy Boys? I had probably, I don't know, 30 Hardy Boys books, and I used to collect them like comic book collectors, right? And Nancy Drew. I had all the Nancy Drew books too, because as a kid, I would just think, oh, I want to solve that mystery. To me, like the book was almost a little bit too long though, because I wanted to read it faster. So I knew that when we started writing these kinds of books that we wanted the pages to turn fast.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to do with this book and I've learned something from that. You know, I'm kind of getting the reaction that people had to the book and realizing, okay, so we have one more book I want to write with Zondervan. And it's changing the way I'm thinking about writing that book because I'm figuring that, yeah, I'm learning something from this book. What works, what doesn't work. But sometimes when you're trying a creative approach, it means you have to be comfortable with failure, right? Because if you're going to be creative, sometimes things are going to stick, some things are going to be really terrible. And you have to be ready to take the risk, or you really can't be creative, right? You can't be conservative and think you're going to push any limit. And what we're trying to do with this kind of an apologetics book is create a new lane, right? Because as I was writing, I was thinking, originally they just asked me to write a book on Jesus that would kind of complete the work I did as a new believer, as a new kind of investigator of Christianity.
Yeah.
And I chronicled half of it in Cold Case. And I always had this thing, I was never really talked about it much, a little bit in Cold Case, the stuff that's outside of the Gospels. Cold Case is about everything that's in the Gospels.
Right.
But what if there were no Gospels? What would you know about Jesus just from the fuse and fallout of history? That's what we do in these no-body murders. We don't have a crime scene because he got rid of the body. We never found the body. We never took any photographs. I mean, sometimes it's years later we're working this. I was telling people that I've had one of these cases, these no-body murders. This guy convinced her family. There's a national case where everyone's talking about, right, with the gal who goes missing, and then they eventually find her body. So they know it's a murder, and then he goes missing, and they got to try to find him, and then they find his body. Well, imagine if they never found her body. That's what these cases are like. Like, you're not even sure what happened to her. You assume she's dead, but you don't really know if she's dead because no body's ever. She could be hiding really well, you know. Yeah. But you would also know if she's the kind of person who would hide. And this is all the stuff we do in these cases in front of a jury. We say, look, on the day she left, or the day she was killed, if she was killed, that's a bomb that went off. And we don't know what happened, what kind of bomb that was, but we do know that all bombs have a fuse and all bombs have fallout afterwards. We could tell you what kind of bomb it is just from the fuse and fallout. Well, that's what we're doing here. What kind of bomb is Jesus? We can do that from the fuse and fallout of history. Forget about, if you didn't have access to the New Testament. That's why I start off with the kind of a thought experiment. Hey, what if all the New Testaments in the world have been ruined, have been destroyed?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I learned a lot just in putting it together, and that's where we're going to kind of end the discussion tonight. But I wanted to, and you kind of already alluded to it, just get your insight on what made you write this particular book. It almost felt like this should have been the first book, almost, because this is kind of how you came to faith.
Well, and that's why I've always said in my public talks that my testimony does not matter. And people will say, "Can you share your testimony?" No. But number one, I am kind of sharing it's the evidence was my testimony.
Right.
I can tell you the next day I read this, the next day I read it. It's going to be pretty boring. Yeah. That's number one. But number two, we are too testimony dependent as a culture, Christians, in the sense that we'll say, yeah, this thing happened and I knew it was from God and God's changed my life. Well, Mormons do the same thing.
Right.
Muslims do the same thing. I mean, everyone's got an experience that they think defines and demonstrates that their worldview is true. Now, I'm not against experiences, but they're not connected to evidence. And so I've always resisted telling much about my personal story. Also, I had to get to a place in my writing where my wife was more comfortable. When you first start, you're not sure you want to be that. I wasn't, as a cop, I was very hesitant to say much about where I live, what I do, what my family structure is like, who my kids' names are. I'm more hesitant earlier than I am now.
Yeah.
So a lot of that just didn't come out in the first book because I really wanted to focus on the evidence. Although I always say that it doesn't matter what your experience is, and I'm not interested in your testimony. What matters is whether it's true.
I agree.
And so that's where I always camp. But here, people have asked about this for so long that I just thought, okay, this will be the place where I tell a little bit of that story. And I didn't, tell a lot. I mean, I don't go into my family background, I don't do a lot of that,
right?
Because that's still stuff that I don't think matters.
Yeah.
But I did want to tell the story of this case. And in the next book, I'm going to get, I think, more specific on a single case as well. And because I'm learning from this book what people find energizing.
Yeah.
And so I want to be able to leverage that. And also, we've talked about this too. You and I have talked about it, that each of us, when we are called to share the gospel, we want to be able to do it in a way that is unique to what God has given us and our story, right? Like each of us has a unique set of experiences, a unique set of skills. And so I'm not looking to write somebody else's book.
Right.
You know, I'm always looking to write the book, and I want all of us to write the book that only we could write. Right. So this is the kind of thing we're trying to do here. And there'll be other people in the history of this movement who will have a law enforcement background, and they'll be able to do something similar, I'm sure. And but until then, I'm just going to take advantage of the kind of the experiences I've had to kind of talk about what's most important, which isn't my experiences. It's the case for Jesus.
Yeah, but so I mean, they're kind of intertwined though, because you're, like you said, your evidence or the evidence is kind of your testimony. So they're not necessarily
right. They're not exclusive. Yeah, true.
And for me, so I came to faith at a younger age, and I accidentally discovered apologetics, but I'm just a very logical minded type person. So it just appealed to me at first, and I was just kind
absolutely.
of anyway. So let's talk about first of all, if you're just joining in, get the book. It's available on Amazon. Person of Interest. We're not going to give the whole book away tonight, but we're going to give you enough to know what you're going to be getting when you do go get it and read it. So I want to set this question up that most of the anti-Christian rhetoric, and I don't mean those who are against certain Christian values, but those who seek to disprove or debunk Christianity as a whole, there's usually there's a lot of revisionism in their thinking, right? For example, people may say things like Christianity obviously exists. That's undeniable. And so we know, right, air quotes, that the resurrection's false. We just know it. And so now we have to figure out a way to explain the empty tomb, the appearances, the church, the start of the early church, because we already know that there is no resurrection, right? They're starting from that.
We presume that nothing miraculous could ever happen. Yeah.
Right. And so now you made the point in the book, and I never thought about it this way, that the Jewish writers, they wouldn't have known enough about these other God tales or in order to even patch together some kind of fake copycat Messiah, tale. And I think that's really interesting because I think some people don't even challenge the assumption that even if Jesus was a copycat, the Jews or the Jewish writers didn't have enough background knowledge to be able to copy others. So can you elaborate on some of the similarities when you made this list of all the other gods and their criteria?
Yeah. So
even more so the vast differences between the data you collected. Yeah.
And part of what we're doing, and the great thing about a book like this is that this is like a graphic novel. So Zondervan gave me 2 years to build the stage presentations, because I do a lot of conferences for this book, because I knew that if I could talk about this book in front of a jury, like if you could test run your closing argument in front of a jury 100 times, trust me, when you finally go to trial, you'll have a really convincing closing argument because you've seen what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah.
Well, this is true when you write a book, and I did that with Cold Case. I had been talking about Cold Case, the stuff in Cold Case Christianity for years, visually, before I ever wrote the first book. But here now I'm going to write another book, and I haven't had a chance to talk about this publicly in this robust way. So they gave me 2 years, and I built all these presentations, and I gave these presentations, and then I wrote a book from the presentations. The book then has all of the illustrations. 400 illustrations from the visual presentations are now in the book. So it's a kind of a graphic novel. So the great thing about it, we can talk about all the detail, but you really won't experience it until you see it, because it's like a graphic novel, right? Because every page, if you open it up, if there's not a list, there's an image. And
that's true.
So that's just the way it is. So that was my goal, was to make sure, like a kid's book, that you'd never open a page without an illustration.
Yeah.
So this is like a kid's book for adults. So the idea here is to trace the fuse that leads up to Jesus, because the fuse that leads up to a murder will show you how he's planning for that murder, how he really is moving things around to make sure he can get rid of her body and all that stuff. He gives them away. The fuse will give you away. Well, the fuse of history kind of gives away Jesus. And one of the things we talk about is that there's a spiritual fuse. Lots of people groups are examining they believe in lots of different mythologies, and these skeptics will say, yeah, Jesus is just another in the law. So let's get this right. If you look at the Jewish history in the Old Testament, tell me how typically God feels about the other gods. What is his admonition toward Jews related to their embracing of other deities? What is his admonition about even marrying or associating with people groups that embrace the other deities. It's always negative. Agreed?
Yeah.
So if you're
Yeah.
suggesting that the first century authors of the Gospels, in trying to convince their fellow Jews that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, they're going to cobble together a story based on pagan mythologies.
Mm.
Really? Okay, so that's just what's happening here. Like they would not, I don't think so. But what's interesting is, and this is fair, is that you've got a number of ancient mythologies, hundreds and hundreds of them. And if you read through all of them, that's a big job. And I had 2 research assistants to help me do this. I was just looking what's similar. What's similar between Attis and Osiris? What's similar between Heracles and Mithras? What's similar between all these guys, all these deities? And just to start, now it took several passes because we would like identify like 5 like really obvious similarities, and then you'd like find oh this is similar. I saw this 3 times now, and you're like
Yeah.
go back and read it again. Just make sure we didn't miss it on all the other ones. And so we read through these mythologies over and over and over again, ending up with about 15 similarities.
Okay.
Now those 15 similarities could easily have been 18. We could have stretched it. But then you'd find that there'd be fewer of these similarities in each mythology. So you'll see that in the 15 we've identified, that these mythologies only have anywhere between 6 to 10 of them. So it's not like they all have these 15. Some have like the most you'll see is like 10 in any one mythology, and the least you'll see is about 6. But interestingly, these are if you look at them, they're very broad. So if you could say it's true that, for example, all the gods can perform miracles. Well, duh. I mean, if your God doesn't perform miracles, he's probably not a god. So I would expect that everyone could do that. Now, the kinds of miracles they perform are very different.
Yeah.
You could say that most, but not all, but most appear miraculously in some weird extra natural way. But how they appear is very different. Most will grant eternal life or survive the grave in some way, but how they survive the grave is very different depending on story. So to argue that yeah, they're all rising and dying the same way, they're all coming into the world the same way through a virgin, that's just a lie. That's just not either not knowing or assuming or trying to draw parallels that are really stretching the facts. But it is interesting, don't you think, that there are these 15 similarities? But here's what if you list them and start to read through them, you realize, oh yeah, these are like the most obvious expected, kind of common expectations that anyone who would think, if I said to you, hey, imagine that there's a God, and I don't have no experience. You've never read through Christianity. You have no experience with a world religion, but I want you to imagine there is a deity that has all power. Well, you would start to kind of like imagine certain characteristics of this deity. Yeah. And it turns out those are the common expectations of all deities. Even if you were to invent a new one today, you'd probably include some of these expectations.
Right.
Interestingly, one person shows up in history who embodies all 15 characteristics, even when no other deity embodies more than 10. And it's Jesus of Nazareth who has all 15.
Yeah.
Now, it seems to me that this is a pretty simple truth, that when the expected meets the expectations of the expector, you get a great result.
Yeah.
When you don't meet the expectations of the expector, you're like surprised and you don't move. I discovered this many times on the job. When I was working undercover, I looked like a bum. And whenever I would respond to a citizen as a police officer, they would say, "Give me a break." They wait for the uniformed officer because they expect that guy to be, because their expectations of an officer are not. I wasn't meeting their expectations, and so I used to always have to get my badge out, and like I knew the first 2 minutes were going to be me convincing this guy I'm actually a police officer. You can tell me this because I'm working this case,
right?
But because I was not meeting their expectations. Well, if God wanted to enter into the world and meet the vast majority of expectations that people have about God, he would have to arrive at a time when these people are still worshiping their myths. And these things start to fall off the map in the Common Era. But there's a window, in which Jesus appears in the middle of that window, in which he appears at the time when most people are still worshiping the myths and have the common expectations that Jesus actually meets most robustly. These common expectations are not an evidence that Jesus was borrowed, but they're an evidence for the deity of Jesus, because they are the foundation upon which God enters into the world. If we all are created in the image of God, why would we be surprised that we would have common expectations about God? and that when God shows up, this is, by the way, clear to Paul. Paul was aware of the fact that these ancients were worshiping all kinds of mythologies on Mars Hill. He says, you people are super religious, man. You got a tomb for everybody here. You got a monument for everybody, even monuments for the unknown God. But I'm going to show you the real God. And here's what he says. I know that this Jesus guy is the real guy because unlike your mythologies, none of those stories claim to be eyewitness accounts.
Mm-hmm.
They're written from the minds of poets, as C.S. Lewis would say.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't even read like they were intended to be eyewitness accounts. Yet I'm here to share with you not what your poets think about God, but what we saw. And to have a mythology that comes from the mind of a poet is different than a claim about God that comes from the mouths of observers, of witnesses. And that is why he says the difference between Jesus and what you're worshiping is that we saw this with our own eyes. Yes. And that's the clear difference. And so Lewis puts it this way, that the myths, man's myths, are simply tales. Now, when he uses the word myth, he doesn't mean a falsehood. Mm-hmm. He means a narrative about deity. That's how he's using the word myth. He would say that man's myths come from the minds of ancient poets, whereas God's myth is Jesus grounded in what we call real things. And that's what Paul is saying on Mars Hill.
Wow. It's a lot to chew on there, but it's so good to look, you all, if you're jumping in late, make sure you go get the book by Jim Warner Wallace. My guest tonight is Person of Interest. And I think I can count on one hand, and I don't say this as a bad thing. I know some of my pre-sub friends will feel different, but I think I can count on one hand the amount of scripture you quoted, which was intentional, obviously.
Yeah.
So look, we're not against scripture, just so
no. And I get this complaint from people who will say to me, yeah, you can't know anything about Jesus unless you are looking at the New Testament. Of course you can't. And here's the illustration I would use. There are times, and this happens, where you'll be at a Harvest Crusade, or you'll be at a Billy Graham crusade. And Billy always had the Bible in his hands, but it didn't matter if he had the Bible in his hand. He had it all memorized, and so he would preach as though that Bible was almost like a prop, right? I mean, he knew what was in that Bible word for word, and he would just recite that back to you as part of his sermon. Have you ever been in a plane with somebody who can evangelize really well because they've memorized the Romans road? Yep. They actually have memorized those verses in the book of Romans that they can then share with the person next to them. Is it possible for somebody to come to faith based on verses from Scripture or descriptions of Jesus they're getting from Scripture, even though they don't have the Bible in their hands?
Absolutely.
I think it is, right? This is what the history of evangelism is probably built on. And in the first century, is it possible that Peter could truly share the truth with Cornelius when he doesn't appear to have an Old Testament scroll in his hand when he's doing it? And there is no New Testament. Could he say enough about Jesus to Cornelius so that Cornelius, according to Scripture, and everyone in his household was saved? How could that be possible? Well, because he knew enough to be able to recite to Cornelius the truth. So what if the source of information is not the person sitting next to you who's memorized 50 scriptures that they're willing to share with you and bring you to faith? But what if the source for that information is the history of science innovators who also wrote about Jesus, from whom you can reconstruct the story of Jesus and the gospel and all the teaching of Jesus, and even some of the deeper theology related to Jesus? Yeah. What if the source for that is the artwork, international artwork all over the world, drawing episodes of the Gospels, painting episodes, creating stained glass of episodes of the Gospels? What if the source for that material is just the buildings on major universities that either have the images of Jesus or the scriptures still engraved in those original, the top 15 buildings, top 15 campuses in the world were founded by Christians even today. So they don't
give it all away yet. We're going to get
there. My point is, what if that was the source? The source is not somebody who's memorized 40 pieces of scripture, but it turns out it's every nook and cranny of culture, because the fingerprints of Jesus are everywhere.
Everywhere.
Would it be possible 1,000 years from now, if somebody had destroyed every New Testament, to know enough about Jesus just from his fingerprints in culture to come to a saving faith in Jesus?
Yeah.
I actually think it would. The same way it's possible for Peter to share with Cornelius, for your person sitting next to you in the plane to share the Romans road with you, That's the kind of impact that Jesus had. That's
Yeah.
why the fuse and the fallout will restore everything you need to know about the bomb.
Yeah.
And that's why it's such a powerful case. It's not that I'm suggesting we would ever eject and get rid
Right.
of Scripture. I'm just suggesting that if Jesus is who he said he was, we should see this kind of impact.
Right.
Like that should be more than just a couple of like I hear people say, well, look, if he's God, you mean to tell me that okay, so God's going to come and get like 4 little old pieces of parchment are going to be written in the gospel? No, actually, if you knew anything about history, you'd know that he didn't just stay there.
Right.
That it turns out that he had an explosive impact on literature and art and music and education and science
Right.
and world religions. He had that kind of explosive impact. And that's why I think that this is part of the cumulative, larger case for the historicity and deity of Jesus.
Amen. And so let's talk about some of those, some of the material, we'll call it, that comprises the written history, not just of within Christianity, but concerning Christianity, I guess. And so you have these 3 groups you delineated: the Christians who like Jesus, the non-Christians who liked Jesus, which sounds weird, but it exists.
Yeah.
The non-Christians who dislike Jesus. So can you kind of briefly explain those groupings, and then also the quantity and the depth of those writings and those quotations, and how that kind of secures Jesus's place in history as a factual, actual, individual. Real quick, so because you said something that I think society needs to understand. Even if you don't believe Christianity is true, even if you don't believe the Bible, when you read the New Testament, it doesn't read the same way as other quote unquote religious books. That we have to at least agree on. I think most scholarly skeptics would agree with that. That when you read the Gospels, when you read the letters of Paul, they read as though it's a person who's trying to communicate actual information about actual people.
Right.
It doesn't
Events.
read, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just
You're
that
right.
alone makes it a little. It's not like the Book of Mormon or the Vedas or even the Quran. It doesn't even read that same way.
Right.
But anyway, can you talk
Well,
about these 3
yeah,
groups?
no, what's interesting is the Book of Mormon itself will do a similar thing. But again, you should be able to then, if the Book of Mormon is true, you should be able to find external confirmation for the Book of
Right.
Mormon, right? There's a 1,000-year period of time in the Book of Mormon from 600 BC to 400 AD, none of which has ever been corroborated by a single piece of archaeological evidence. There's no cities ever described,
Right.
no buildings with any kinds of scriptures or any kind of name of any Mormon character that's allegedly in the history of Mormonism. No people group, no coins, no weapons, no chariots, no animals. None of the stuff described in the Book of Mormon has ever been recovered anywhere on the North American continent. That should give you pause. That is not the case, of course, for New Testament history.
Right.
Now, that's the difference. Now, this doesn't make it true just because you can confirm certain aspects of it.
Right.
But what's interesting is if I wanted to reconstruct the story of Jesus, well, look, I could reconstruct the story of Elvis the same way. In other words, Elvis was one of those characters who had such an impact on the music industry that when he died when I was a teenager, it was a big deal. As a matter of fact, from that point on, like anywhere between 8 and 2 books on Elvis have been written every year for 40 years. And those books are divided into those 3 groups. There are Presleys who liked liked Elvis and would talk about Elvis in a favorable way. And there were non-Presleys who also liked Elvis, who would say things. And then there are non-Presleys who didn't like Elvis, who would kind of like say things that aren't true about Elvis. And those books can be divided into those 3 groups. Now, what's interesting is as those 3 groups would write over time, the stories would be all kinds of rabbit trails, all kinds of things that aren't true, all kinds of legends and mythologies about Elvis emerged because people were making a dollar on this kind of thing, right? And there were people who liked to leverage the story of Elvis for their own selfish gain. And they would have to, though, stand on some true claims about Elvis. And if you were to look at all the common claims of all of these different books, you could reconstruct on the very minimal common claims of the Elvis story of a guy who succeeded in Memphis and wrote certain songs and recorded these certain songs. But you'll also see that sometimes they'll say, well, yeah, he spent the night over here. We know from records he spent the night in Memphis on this particular day. But one of these books says he slept with some starlet while he was there. That part is the legend that comes out of this. But they have to at least admit the common true claim that he was in Memphis that night.
Gotcha.
Before they tell the lie. Something very similar happens with the story of Jesus. You have people who actually like Jesus, who would call themselves Christians and actually held to true Orthodox Christian beliefs about Jesus. Those are the church fathers. They write a lot about Jesus, but there were a bunch of people who liked Jesus and wanted to leverage his story for their own selfish gain. We see this in all the non-canonical gospels. If you read those, they stand on the common stories of the gospels before they change, and they'll say, yeah, but he had this secret information that he just gave Philip, or they just gave Judas, and now they're rabbit trailing off. Of course, they have to admit to the night in Memphis before they can tell the lie about what happened in Memphis. Now, there's also a group of people who are not Christian at all, and they don't like Jesus. They don't want to leverage him for their own benefit. They don't see anything positive about it. And those are the Greeks and Romans and Egyptians and Persians and Jews who also had their voices are also recorded on ancient manuscripts. What I did is I went back through all the ancient manuscripts and I simply divided out the voices. Who are these people who are saying things about Jesus? And I made a one robust list that I sent to Gary Habermas. And I said, what do you think of this? Because I wanted to make sure that he was, he's one of the foremost scholars on he's doing his huge volume work on this.
Magnum opus.
Yeah, his magnum opus on the resurrection. But what I noticed is right away is that of those three groups, there are far more non-Christian voices in the first 300 years before Christianity becomes the religion of the empire than there are Christian voices who have something to say about Jesus.
Yeah.
There just are in those first 300 years. Now, I only stopped there because I think that the argument could, I think, fairly be made that, power corrupts. And once Christianity becomes powerful,
right,
then I think you see some distortions, which you would expect to see under the corruption of power. So I get that. I want the kind of earliest versions of claims about Jesus and who are making these claims. And so that impact is important. I want you to think about this for a second. There are Roman emperors who lived at the same time as Jesus who do not have as many voices chronicled on ancient manuscripts as Jesus of Nazareth.
Right.
He had far more literary impact in manuscript evidence than the other ancients who were his contemporaries with a lot more power than he had. Not only that extended out into years and years of books written about Jesus, to the point where if you were to examine the Library of Congress and look at the historical figures who have been written about, no one has been written about more than Jesus of Nazareth. If you do a Google book search for the same names, you'll find that he still leads even internationally in terms of even like self-authored. Google Books catches everything.
Yeah.
So you're kind of stuck with everything, but no one's been written about more than Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah.
Not only that, there are Christ figures. When people write fiction, they even build their fictional characters around the person of Jesus.
Yeah.
And so when you see this now, and I've kind of tried even screenplays, I put it all in one huge illustration. And I think it's more powerful when you see all of those ancient voices in the circle around Jesus, because I found every one of them and I drew every one of them and I've labeled every one of them. So you can see who they are. I want you to see both the church fathers and the hostile non-church, non-Christian who said something about Jesus. So I think in the end that my goal is to kind of show people that he's had more impact than anyone else on literature.
Absolutely. And I so appreciate your dual talent of being an apologist and an artist, because I don't know if that combination exists with anybody else, but your artwork, I mean, it does, for those who are visual learners. Like when you guys get the book, you'll remember this kind of bullseye with the fuse in the middle and how this concentric circles are kind of closing in on that. Like that's a memorable image that you'll always be able to refer back to. And if you're talking to a skeptic, you could probably just show them all the pictures and and make the case. You don't even have to have them read the book.
Yeah, a lot of it is, I mean, I think that young people read now sometimes these kinds of books from image to image. A lot of us will kind of skip over the images if we don't think it's important, but I think it's kind of a flip, right? We're a visual culture right now, and I wanted to do it visually. That's why I think the book reads relatively fast. So when I record audiobooks, most of my books take 3 days to record. This book took 2 days to record. It's just faster because it's so visual. It's not as many words.
Yeah. Man, this is really good. I always, a lot of times when I present different places, I'll ask, or I'll make the statement, like, why is there anything at all written about a Jewish carpenter from nowhere who built nothing?
Right.
Like, why is it like not just that there's gospels? Why is there anything written about him at all? Right. He's just a a guy from the middle of nowhere who was a carpenter who built nothing that we know of.
And so what I wanted to do is to show, I did this in the last chapter, we know that he's a nobody, but you really recognize the nobodiness of Jesus in terms of, what you would expect from a worldly perspective when you compare him with other somebodies. So if you were to say, give me a list of the top 100 people in the first century anywhere on planet Earth, well, you did a list of people. So I put that list of people on that page for you so you can see all of them. Now, you're only going to recognize probably about 10 to 20% of that list.
Right.
Because there's people from all over every corner of the world, right? And most of us don't know our ancient history all that well. We recognize Nero, but after you get to some of the bigger leaders in the world, you're kind of like, I don't know who that guy is, or who that woman is, or who that poet is, or who that we don't know. But it's Jesus who you do know, who has changed it. There's a reason why we call this the first century, even though it isn't the first century, and it isn't the first century in which humans lived or recorded history.
Right.
Yet it's none of those other people, all of them combined, did not have the influence to call this the first century. Then I said, okay, well, look at all the other people who claim deity. And make a list of all the other gods and religious leaders of prominence throughout history. You'll also only recognize a small percentage of those names. But Jesus changes everything.
Yeah.
Buddha existed well before Jesus. Buddhism and Hinduism preceded Jesus. Zoroastrianism, all that preceded Jesus by many, many centuries. Yet they didn't initiate the common era.
Right.
And it's not just a power issue. It's an influence issue. Because you could argue, well, look, it's about the power of the Roman Empire. Well, that's just true. But there was an empire that ruled. The strongest empires in the world were Egyptian or Persian or Greek. Yet they didn't inaugurate the kind of influence that the Romans did. And if you said, well, yeah, but all of science, for example, everyone who was in Europe in the 16th century was a Christian. So no duh that, this is going to, well, but why is science coming out of Europe?
Right.
Well, there's lots more people who are not in Europe. Science.
And why are they Christian?
It could have exploded in Asia.
Yeah.
It didn't. It exploded in Europe under Christendom.
Yeah.
That's unique. And it's true. It's kind of hard. It could have exploded in Persia. It could have exploded in the Middle East under Islam. But it explodes the scientific revolution. And it's not that we are the victors who wrote history. I'm telling you, go back and look at the history of chemistry. You're not going to be able to write it through any other people group.
Yeah.
You're going to write it through the people who were doing the founders of the faith, of the disciplines, who happen to be Christ followers.
Right. So. And I remember I did a video a while ago, and part of the thing that I listed, I think I listed maybe 27 of the scientists, but these are, Newton, Kepler, all these, the big ones. And they, in some way, shape, or form, they all said, we expected to be able to do science in our discipline precisely because we expected God to already exist and therefore have an ordered world from which we could even do science.
That's right. So those are the igniters. That worldview, the Christian worldview, ignites the exploration of the natural world in a way that other natural philosophers who preceded Christianity were unwilling or unable to examine the world the same way. Either they had a view of matter that was unworthy, or they had a view of deity that was so chaotic and duplicitous and plural, the lots of different gods who are unruly and unpredictable. So they didn't trust that what they would find would follow the mind of a single, orderly, rational God. That principle, although it seems so simple, it seems so fundamental that you can take it for granted, but it turns out to be the thing that ignites science's exploration of the natural world, unlike any other. Right. And also just the fact that in the, a lot of science is done in university settings. So that group that ends up founding the modern university, don't be surprised that they're one of the leaders. So for example, it's those three universities, right, at Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, all initiated and founded by Christians, that end up being the parent universities to about 22, 24 daughter universities. And from those daughter universities, the people who are the leaders in the scientific revolution emerge, and they're doing science. So it's all coming out of yet another igniter, which is the modern university, yet again, another invention of Christ followers. So it's a lot of what we would say. And by the way, we're in a culture now where everything is politicized, everything has been weaponized. And for the most part, we are hesitant to even trust the sciences. Be careful of that. Don't allow yourself to go there, because we have always led in the sciences. We'd have to make a conscious choice now, an errant choice, if we step away right now. And I think that it is true that and I think this is as political as it is metaphysical, that lots of folks who do the sciences right now would reject any form of supernaturalism. And there's a sense, is that because we have really good philosophical foundations and reasons to reject? A lot of people who reject supernatural explanations have not even thought about why they might reject these. They just do this.
It's usually a priori. It's
yes, that's right. It's just an innate first guttural response, right? Like they haven't said, "Well, I've read Hume and I've read all these, and this is why." No, they haven't done any of that. They just have decided they're within a tradition. But that was not the case, and it doesn't need to be the case today. And by the way, I have one page on the book. You'll see they're just the illustrations of all the living scientists who are Christians who are making significant contributions in places like, it's not just the fathers of modern chemistry, which has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's also the father of computer sciences. I've got a list of those. Of quantum mechanics, I've got a list of those. It's not just that you're stuck in antiquity to see you've got a leader. We have continued to found and father scientific disciplines right up into the current generation, and we still win awards at the same pace as we always have, even in the current generation.
Yeah.
But what's happened is, if you were to search, this was a struggle for us. If you search online for the religious identity of scientists, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Most of the sources you're going to find have either ignored that or scrubbed it.
Or especially if they don't have tenure yet.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like so again, it's not so much that universities have rationally moved toward a view of naturalism that excludes us. It's that they have moved politically toward a philosophy that excludes conservative Christians altogether anyway. Right. And that movement politically, I think, is even more dramatic than a philosophical movement about naturalism.
No, I definitely agree. So since I'm going to jump to the science question I was going to ask you, since we're there now, because I've interviewed and met Dr. Hugh Ross and Fazal Rana and Mike Strauss. And for those that don't know, Hugh Ross is, to me, the world's leading astrophysicist, or one of them. Fazal Rana is a biochemist. And both of them, by the way, came to faith by doing science. So just in case you haven't heard his story, you can watch it on my channel. Hugh Ross, when he went to school, was an atheist. He became saved by looking at all the world religions and looking at the book of nature, as he calls it. So Mike Strauss is a particle physicist. He's been to CERN. Like these are top of the field scientists of present day who say, based on their scientific discipline, that led them to Christianity. And so I just want everybody to understand that it's not like a revisionist way of proving Christianity. It's leading them to it. Kind of like as an atheist, you became saved by looking at the evidence. So because, we've done a lot of, or at least I've done a lot of, and you wrote a book called God's Crime Scene, which pretty much is all about the scientific evidence.
Right.
For those that don't have it, get that one too. But I don't want to necessarily ask about the evidence itself, the cosmological and teleological, but just, can you connect the dots for us? And you kind of did it already, but can you connect the dots for us just between the progress of science and the appearance of Jesus in history? Yeah.
What I thought was interesting, I don't know why we started on this project, but I asked my research assistants, I want to identify the significant historical characters, historical figures who have been identified as scientists, because it's going to be hard, because initially they were just called natural philosophers, and in antiquity it's going to be like, how do you define somebody as a scientist? And this was there was no campus in which science was being done in the 4th century BC. You're just looking at people that we have kind of, in hindsight, we've said, okay, these folks were working in these disciplines in such a way that it felt like they were doing foundational work that later became part of the scientific enterprise. Yeah. So anyway, so you start just looking for this, and there are some books which we used, but to be honest, there's not a lot written that is isolating this out this way. So you got to find creative ways of doing the search. So we ended up with several printed resources. Several universities have got their resources online, and I've kind of quoted those in the in the footnotes and the case notes, because a lot of the Ivy League schools will have some of their stuff is available online. So we start searching through all this. And so I start making a list, and I knew this was going to be a chore, and my wife thought I was crazy when I was doing it. So I'm identifying all of these scientists of every background, just dump them all on a list. Now that list was really ridiculous. A book as a book. Now we got to go back to the list and see how many of these are Christians. And so I started to chart these, and I use images so you can see that you can actually find there's people who have drawn ancient pictures of these. They probably aren't anything what they used to look like. But, if you Google this guy from the 3rd century, who's a scientist and some or a natural philosopher, someone has illustrated him in history. So I find that illustration. I make this chart with all the faces of all in each generation, in each century. And you can kind of see them. I wasn't sure what I was going to find. But what you see is that those people who are doing work that might be foundational to natural philosophy kind of like is just, it's about the same. It's level. And at some point it begins to climb. And it climbs as you'd expect. And as it gets to the 20th century, 21st century, of course, it's off the charts, right? It's like an explosion. It all really explodes at the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries in what we call the scientific revolution in Europe. So it starts to explode there, right? But you see some bumps. And I thought that was interesting. Now, this may be a coincidence, but what I wanted to see is where does Jesus in all of this fall? Well, when you plug him in the timeline, you'll see that he's right before the curve, right before the progressive kind of the geometric kind of progression of explosion of activity. So the question is that just a coincidence, or is somehow he a catalyst? Because you could easily have found him someplace else. He could have been 1,000 years earlier or 1,000 years later. He could have ended up being all kinds of scientific stuff going on, and then Jesus appears in the middle of it. He could have appeared anywhere in history. Is he a catalyst, or is he a coincidence? So I started to look at the kind of history of Christianity, and it turns out that a lot of these bumps in activity, if you look at where Christianity is made, is no longer being persecuted, the edicts of Milan and Thessalonica. If you look at where cathedral schools and monasteries are established, if you look at where Muslims are contributing big, if you look at where that's the one area that's not Christian. Again, the Muslims contribute like dramatically until about the 12th century, and then they drop off the map. But then as you look at, universities, where are universities in this timeline? Where's the printing press? Where's the Reformation? Just follow it. You'll see that it seems like there's a correlation. I'm not even going to suggest that there is, but I do know this. That explosion of activity is post Jesus, and the identity of the absolutely overwhelming, oversized impact of scientists are Christ followers. The scientific revolution is dominated by Christ followers. That's something you can point to. I've got a list of the 950. And again, I'm only able to get tip of the iceberg information here, because a lot of this there is no one who's written a definitive academic that I'm aware of on the Christians who are involved in the sciences, who have identified every single one in the history of science who's ever been involved. I wish there was something like that, but there isn't. So you have to kind of do the best you can. But I do know this, I'm underestimating it. I know I'm underestimating it, because I can only identify so many of these as Christians. There's a bunch more that I just don't know if they're Christian. I suspect where they are in the world, who their parents were, what university they're working at. But if it doesn't say, this dude was a priest, this dude was whatever, I'm just going to leave it. Because I just don't know. So I know I'm underestimating the groups. And if you look at that explosion, it's hard not to think that it's a Christian worldview. And I've given 7 igniters in the book, 7 reasons why I think Christianity explodes the sciences. And it's that worldview of Jesus that is different even than the Jewish worldview in the terms of how it moves in the world. It's very similar, though. We are people of the book. We are people who believe in one rational, orderly God. There are lots of things about the Jew. And if you look at the history of Jewish scientists, you will see they are really oversized as well. So they're not going to be a large part of any population group historically in the sciences, and yet they overperform for the percentage of Jewish people who are in the population at the time. So if you look at the Nobel Prize winners in the sciences, the vast majority are Christians. Just true. But the number 2 group are Jews. And if you put the two together, the Judeo-Christian worldview dominates the sciences in terms of Nobel Prize laureates in sciences. So it's just interesting, right? Whereas, agnostics and atheists are about a third of the size of the Jewish group and about a sixth of the size of the Christian group. So it's just interesting to me that that the religious thinkers have dominated the sciences, and this is even post Darwin. There's a sense in which, but once Darwin gets here, come on,
Yeah.
everyone's going to move off that God thing, right? No, actually, in the modern period, post Darwin, the activity of Christianity is even more dramatic. Christians are even more involved in the sciences, and many early Christians interacted with Darwin's ideas, and even many of the fathers of evolutionary disciplines and subsets are even Christ followers. So that these folks, some of these folks did not see necessarily a problem between the two. And, you and I, we've talked to Frank Turek about this and had that conversation before. So we may fall in a different place than some of these guys. We may disagree or agree with some of these guys, but it's clear that it's not impossible to hold to both views.
Right.
And by the way, these folks all wrote about Jesus in their journals and in their letters to one another, so that the story of Jesus can be completely reconstructed from the personal journals, not of the church fathers. As a matter of fact, more information you can gain from the science fathers. Now, I want you to think about that. You can gain, and they quoted scripture. They quoted the verses. They quoted the statements of Jesus. They believed in all the miracles. They recite and reiterate the miracles of Jesus. They were not people who were trying to carve out the miracles like a lot of skeptics do today.
Mm-hmm.
They also believed in the crucifixion of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. These scientists did not see the rub. They felt like if there's a divine being who enters into his creation, I mean, like Frank and I always talk about, right? Like even I can stop gravity, and I'm a finite being.
Right.
Why would not the author of gravity be able to do anything he wants? So they didn't
Great
see
point.
the rub,
That's a great point. One guy left out who's modern, Francis Collins. I believe he just retired from NIH, but he was one of the 3 people, I think, that helped map the human genome.
Right. Okay. So here's a great example of why I think sometimes we are hesitant about science. So Francis Collins, right? He's been involved in all kinds of controversy, though, also around COVID with Fauci, right?
Yep.
So what I see happening is that then we have a visceral reaction politically to something, and we are willing to say that science is we now in our mind don't trust what the science would tell us, because we see that the science can be weaponized. Remember, we know that science doesn't tell us anything, scientists do.
Right.
But the facts are going to help us. The natural revelation is not ever going to deny God's existence. It can't. Right. What we discover in nature. Now, we'll find that people will infer from the facts any number of crazy things.
Right.
But it turns out that when we make a case for God's existence from the science, we're using the exact same scientific data that the skeptics are using. Yep. We just think the better inference is for God, not against God.
Right.
So what I want to be careful is that when we mention any particular scientist's name, if that person we're talking about has a certain political attachment or philosophical attachment, or you associate them with some kind of political movement, everything now in 2021 has come down to political motivations. And that's where we got to be careful, is that we don't start throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because we feel like, hey, science in general belongs on one side of the political aisle or the other. And if it's over there, we can't allow it over here.
Right.
Right?
I agree. I've had that discussion in many forms over the last year and a half.
Yeah.
With both, I don't know, kind of sides of the equation. So I wanted to ask this, because one of the things that was really interesting, I mean, all of it's interesting, but I'm not big into art. I'm not really even that big into music. And so, I know of those things, obviously, but I don't really, it doesn't move me the way some people may be moved by it. And so you have this chapter that looks at the history of art and the influence that Christianity has had in art. So briefly, why is that so significant in affirming the validity of Christ's existence, as well as his impact on all of humanity? Because it wasn't just, oh, this is Christian art over here, just art in general.
Yeah, I mean, the inspirational figure of Jesus in his life has historically motivated and inspired more artists than any other one story, than any other historical figure. So if you look at the history of art and any genre of art in an A to Z national search, so globally, And I have a list of all the art in every nation from A to Z that depicts Jesus. This is not a limited Western phenomena.
Right.
But just because something starts in the West does not mean it doesn't eventually have global impact. If you said, well, yeah, well, so is science strictly a Western belief, a Western phenomenon? And I think people in China right now are still trying to land, they're still exploring space.
Yeah.
They're standing on the shoulders of giants from one portion of history in one part of the world. But science is a global experience. It's a global enterprise. Now, just the fact that it starts in one place does not mean that this influence isn't felt everywhere else. The same rules of chemistry that were discovered in Europe are still being pressed into service in every nook and cranny of the entire globe. So it's not as though, this is no longer right. This is just a Western phenomenon. The same is true for art. As a matter of fact, the Jesus story is more malleable than almost any other story. If you look at how Buddha is depicted in South Africa and how Buddha is depicted in Persia and how Buddha is depicted in India and in China and in South America, pretty much looks the same.
Yep.
Look at how Jesus is depicted in South Africa and Asia. Every people group reinterprets Jesus in their own image, because we hold a worldview in which God creates all of us in his image, and we are all equal in terms of the eyes of God, and we are all unified in our common identity as being image bearers. And this person of Jesus is reflected in the art very differently. And that allows you to stylistically move from genre to genre. So if you look at classical art, if you go all the way to Dadaism or to Expressionism or Impressionism or whatever form of pop art you want to look at, you just move through the centuries from one form of art as it progresses to abstract, representational, all of this, these different genres of art. And then you simply look and search for the top 3 artists in every historic genre. You won't be surprised probably to find that artist has imaged Jesus at some point or another in his catalog or her catalog. This is just the nature of Jesus. The top artists in every genre were inspired by Jesus of Nazareth. Now, why does that really matter?
Yeah.
Because art matters. I could argue that art matters more than probably a lot of other things we think matter. Politics are downstream from art. You want to change a culture, convince a culture, you'll do it with art. You'll do it with movies and music. Before you'll change those ways of thinking subtly. In 1985, when I was getting my master's in architecture, the artistic movement in which we were all working was a movement called postmodernism. Now, we embrace that today as a philosophy that relates to how we perceive truth and pluralism and all of that. But in art, it's been dead for 30, 40 years. We've already moved past postmodernism. It starts in the arts. It starts in the imagination of artists and writers and thinkers, in music. And then it moves eventually into the culture. Culture is always downstream of the arts. And so if you want to move and change the thinking of culture, you could think you could vote it. It's not going to be a political candidate that's going to do that for you.
Right.
It's going to be the arts. We have to reclaim the arts, because that's where the imagination about what we could be and what we ought to be is formed, especially with young people.
Yeah.
And so we need to reclaim that. And it turns out we had great dominance in that area. It's our willful rejection. Remember, all we're doing here, God can come in, but the thing that has to exist first before you and I can love God is the freedom to hate God. We have to have that freedom first. God will always give us that freedom. God is not going to come in and say, okay, I'm going to overwhelm you with such data that none of you could ever resist me. It would not be, we would never truly love God. But that freedom that he's given us, we often abuse. So he comes and makes an incredible impact on history. And then we find that many of us are going, but look, you and I haven't rejected it. It's not that everyone has rejected it. And global, don't get caught up thinking, here you are and you're in Chicago, right? And I'm in the Chicago area. Am I right, Alex?
I'm in Chicago, yep.
Yeah, okay. And I'm in Los Angeles area. Okay, so we don't get caught up in thinking that this is where Christianity has to be measured as a success or a failure. Globally, it is exploding. Christianity is still growing, okay?
I've been trying to tell people that for so this last year. I've been mentoring a pastor in Pakistan, and even when I hear some people post something about Christians don't want or Christians don't like, but you're saying it living in the United States, and what I have to tell people is the majority of Christians do not live in this country.
That's right. That's
Like
right.
we have to get out of that mentality. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's so true, right? And
Yeah.
so what we have to remember that because we might be in a place in time and in a culture right now that is turning its back on Christianity while it explodes everywhere else, does not mean. I was listening to one Chinese sociologist who was talking about missions in China, and there's an expectation I think it's by 2030 that there may be as many as 250 million Christians
Wow.
in China, which would make it the largest Christian nation.
Wow.
There may be an impact then on how China is governed, how China moves, and that's why I think the Chinese see that Christianity for the threat that it really is.
Yeah.
So I think in the end, my whole point is that if we have decided that we are not going to, as Christians, take a leadership role in the arts, and we seem like we're in that B position right now, right? Or we kind of stepped away from it. We're not the ones who are pushing the envelopes and being. That's why I want to write books that are creative, because I feel like we have to kind of start to think outside the box a little bit. Not that I think of myself as an artist, but you have to be willing to fail in order to be creative.
Yeah.
And so I just want to encourage us as a family. Let's be willing to fail. Let's try some things. Let's stretch.
That's awesome. I'm actually preparing a talk. It's not for an apologetic. It's more corporate. I'm giving next week, and part of it is going to be on being willing to make mistakes because of what you just said. Obviously, my channel being Relentless Pursuit of Purpose. That last part leans into my function. I believe we have the central purpose to know Christ, make Him known. But then within that, how each of us does it will differ. So I'm not artistic, so I use the gifts God's given me. But the goal, your goal, my goal, our goal is all the same. It's just we're coming at it from different vantage points. And so I definitely, if anybody is listening, I want to encourage you. Look, if you don't want to hear me sing, I trust me. But if that's your thing, then use it to the glory of God. If you're an artist, if you play sports, whatever you do, God can work through anybody. So that's awesome. And so with that, I also want to tap into this part in the book about education. So I think one of the unique things about this book is that since you are an actual investigator and you're looking at this situation and the claims that are being made and still being made, you're helping people, or you're forcing people, especially skeptics, to look at the totality of the evidence. And when we, at the end, we'll talk about the different types of reasoning and stuff like that. But with respect to, I remember Vince Vitale said to me one time, disagreement is okay, but disagreement without alternative is empty. In other words, you can't just say, hey, Jim, I don't believe Jesus died on the cross. Okay. Right. What do you believe? Because something happened. Like,
right.
You can't just leave it there.
What's the alternative? Yeah.
What's the alternative? And so Christians from like even before the New Testament, they're telling people something. They're telling people a certain message.
Right.
And that eventually, as you say, it leads to this educational explosion. Universities exist. So not only were Christians of all eras thoughtful and did they have their beliefs rooted in evidence, but they sought to educate others from the beginning. That's there. So can you elaborate on Jesus as a teacher and on the catalyst of how that kind of was a springboard for not just Christian education, but education more proper?
Yeah, in the same way that music is part of our DNA, we worship. It's the one place where you can be sure that every week there'll be a group listening to somebody singing on a stage. This is the Christian church. So there's a DNA of performance and a DNA of celebration and a DNA of musical worship that is just part of who we are. And the same thing is true with the teaching culture, because Jesus doesn't say go to make converts. He wants us to make disciples. Oh, and that's a lot harder. That means we got to teach them something. And that means in order to teach them the deeper things of God, we're going to have to, number one, do they have written text? Do they have a Bible in their language? Do they even have an alphabet? And a lot of people groups did not have alphabets or were not educated enough to read. So one of the first things that Christians did was provide alphabets and teach them how to read. And then they started schools in which they could disciple them And that discipling pretty early on, and I show it in the book, involves more than just theological training. It involved philosophical training and training in trades. There was a sense in which Scripture argues that we ought to be self-sufficient and we ought to take care for those who are in need. In order to do that, you have to be able to sustain your own income and sustain your own ability. Paul talks about this. He's a tent maker, and he did this without taking the donations of others, although he said he could. He had a right to. So the point is, this kind of training and teaching leads to a teaching culture in which every missionary project is more than just like going out and teaching.
Yeah.
And that meant that the teaching facilities are going to emerge pretty quickly. And then I try to illustrate in the book, I'll show you visually how these things evolve into the universities. And that's really what I think you see in the history of Christianity. And again, from just those campuses, you can visit the campuses of the top 15 universities in the world. They were all founded by Christ followers.
Right.
And all over the world, the top 75 of the top 100 were founded by Christ followers. Just go visit those campuses. You'll find their buildings still bear the images of Jesus, bear the scriptures of the New Testament. You can reconstruct the story of Jesus just from the campuses themselves. You'd have to destroy not only the history of science, but the physical locations of all of those campuses if you wanted to erase Jesus from history.
Right.
There's so much he's touched. His fingerprints are everywhere. And that's what I thought was so compelling about the history, the fallout, is that not just that he had an impact, but that he could be reconstructed from the impact.
That's amazing. The catechizing that you wrote about, which I didn't know and I hadn't thought of, from 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, like kind of, I guess, mini schools, if you want to call them that, where it was math, it was other subjects, but there was almost this holistic approach pretty early on.
Well, as a matter of fact, one of the oldest documents we have next to the Gospels, probably the next oldest document we have, is a document called the Didache, or the Teaching of the Apostles, written for the express purpose of catechizing new converts. Mm-hmm. So it's like, this is a teaching culture from start to finish. People of the book who were trying to make disciples. And that ends up creating a need for educational facilities in which to do that.
Another guy in my graduating class, if you will, Clark Bates,
right?
Who he's over in University of Birmingham, another subsidiary of those schools,
right?
And he's finishing his PhD. But I remember we talked periodically, and he was saying, if you like books in general, just the physical tool of a book, thank Christians.
No kidding.
The Nomina Sacra and the Codex and the Codices and that led up to the first book. There was
I wish I would have included that as well. It's so true. And I think one of the things that's interesting, and this is why I want us to do more than just, so I have a YouTube page also, and we're all contributing at some point to the YouTube universe. But what's interesting is that most people, when they watch a video like this, they're not downloading it. They're just watching it here, which means that if this is all still stored in one place, or in a series of places that could be easily. What's interesting about doing the work we did for Person of Interest is that because these are written documents, when you write 100,000 views does not mean that the video is now in 100,000 locations. 100,000 books, though, means it's all over the world in 100,000 locations. It's much harder to destroy the content.
That's good.
So the story of Jesus is much harder to eradicate because he comes at a time. This is another reason why I think he comes when he comes. You could argue, well, yeah, but but why wouldn't he come now? Well, the story of Jim Wallace and Alex is too easy to destroy because most of our work is not written. Most of our work is online.
Yeah.
And so any online presence is too easy to manipulate and destroy because it's not downloadable geographically.
Yeah.
So the idea that we're working in a generation in a time when all these things had to be written and then stored someplace means that we still have a lot more, even manuscript evidence we're going to eventually discover. We just haven't located it yet. So that's the beauty of this approach, is that it ends up being timely because it also creates a geographic disbursement that we can then mine for data, right? The way you can't do if it was just a switch that could be flipped.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunately with the digital age, all of this can be turned off pretty quickly.
Very true. All right, just a couple more questions. So you made a list, and look, everybody, that's on here now, please get the book, because there literally are.
Yeah, it's hard to explain these lists because they're so. I mean, the footnotes. There's 270 page PDF file you can download that has even more extensive lists. Like if I'm talking about the non-canonical gospels, well, how am I getting this information? Well, I've got a whole list of everything you need to know about the non-canonical gospels, and it's in the PDF file.
Right.
So yeah, it's you don't want to put that in a book because I thought nobody would read that book. Okay.
Couldn't carry it. Couldn't even pick it up.
Yeah. No one's gonna read that.
But even what is in the book, there are lists of like all these universities, all of the artists, musical and otherwise, the graphs, the charts. So anyway, we're not going to go through all that, but you do have this list of the qualities of the other religions, at least what they claimed about their gods. And although we talked about the similarities and differences, but you said no one person or one god had all of them. But just with a few of them, like Krishna and Heracles and Mithras, maybe don't have to do all of them, but just where do the similarities fall short?
Well, so what's interesting is that it wouldn't be surprised that all the world religions that exist today, that followed Jesus in the timeline, that were created after Jesus arrived, they all will hat tip Jesus. So Baha'is acknowledge Jesus, Muslims acknowledge Jesus. But it turns out that even the religions that preceded Jesus, like Hinduism, Buddhism, even some of these religions that no longer exist anymore, like Heracles and Attis and Mithras, once they get into the Common Era, and now Jesus is on the scene, they end up modifying or embracing Jesus in some way. Either their scripture embraces him, or their practices embrace or modify, or their leaders will start talking about Jesus and embracing Jesus and actually, modifying their beliefs. So, for the Buddhist leaders have described Jesus as somebody on the enlightened teacher on the way to Buddhahood. In other words, there's a place for Jesus within the construct of Buddhism, within the construct of Hinduism, and their leaders have even quoted from the Gospels in talking about Jesus. So from the leaders of those other systems and from the scriptures of those other systems, the rough basic outline of Jesus can be recreated. Right. And that's what I think is so fascinating. Remember, even though Buddhism precedes Jesus, when Jesus gets on the scene, he doesn't say you can embrace Buddhism to get to God.
Right.
He's exclusive. Others will say, yeah, he fits over here. Jesus says, no, none of you guys fit over here. Now that's interesting, right?
Yeah.
It's because I've worked cases where I've had 7 suspects for one murder. I had a case where I had at least 7, and this woman was killed. On which of these 7 killed her? And it turns out 6 are pretty commonly not the killer. They don't have the attributes that the one unique suspect who had unique ability, unique access to the body, unique access to the weapon, unique hostility toward the victim. That unique feature about that one will set him apart from the other 6, and he becomes my suspect. Right. Jesus has unique features compared to all the others. He's the one who says nothing you do is going to earn you righteousness in front of God anyway. It's everything that I will do for you. That's a very unusual approach. And unlike the others who are willing to embrace their counterparts, Baha'is will embrace Buddha, Islam. They'll embrace Muhammad as a manifestation, Buddha as a manifestation, Jesus as if anyone came and said they were from God, Baha'u'llah would say, yep, I'm one of those too. We're all manifestations of God. These folks will embrace Jesus in a way that Jesus will singularly reject. Yeah. He stands apart in the list of suspects. And that's why I think he's worth your look. If you weren't somebody who knew much about world religions and you wanted to start with Jesus. He's in all the other religions. Start with him. You might as well, because none of those religions are in him. And that's why I think he's unique.
Very good point. And I remember saying that, I don't know, some talk I was giving, but Jesus, to my knowledge, he's the only one who claimed to be the truth, which is it's an ontological claim that's different than saying I have special access.
Yeah, right.
Every other prophet and guru, they're like, I have special access to this truth. And it's always one person, right? It's like Joseph Smith,
right.
Mary Baker, So Jesus claiming to be in an actual sense the truth was it's very different than any other guru, prophet, God, whatever you want to call him. So I agree. Start with Jesus.
Yeah.
All right.
Definitely.
Final question.
Yep.
We have all this. So go through when you go through the book. We got art. We got art, musical art. Painting art. We've got compare and contrast all the lists, and you get this quantity of stuff. It's kind of like at the end of the Case for Christ movie where he looks at the wall. He's like, man, it would take more evidence not to believe than
Yeah.
So can you just kind of tell everybody as a detective, what is abductive reasoning, or what is abductive?
Well, yeah, it's like you're looking for alternative explanations, right? Like you said, you can argue that you don't agree, but unless you offer an alternative, well, you're just speaking a complaint. You're not offering an explanation. You're just complaining. So the reality of it is we all have to ask the question, how could this guy have this kind of impact? What are the alternatives? Here's what I like to say. There's something about the fuse and fallout of history that definitely demonstrate the historicity of Jesus and the deity of Jesus, even if you have no access to the New Testament.
Right.
Here's what I mean. And people will say this online. I had a skeptic online do a video, and Jesus is similar to Luke Skywalker. Like Luke Skywalker, do you really? Okay, really? Okay, you apparently don't understand the impact that Jesus had on history, because you will not find Luke Skywalker's fingerprints in all of those disciplines. And if 1,000 years from now you think that the entire calendar will be revamped again for another common era based on Luke Skywalker, well, I'm willing to wait for you if you want to wait, but I don't think that's going to happen. Right. It turns out there's no other fictional character, if there is, tell me who it is, in the history of fictional characters who's had the kind of impact that Jesus of Nazareth has had. That means that a proper inference might be that Jesus is not a fictional character, because you cannot find a parallel. So that's a reasonable inference. And there's no other mortal human who has had the impact that Jesus has had. Another proper inference might be that he's not just a mortal human. There is something about the impact and the fingerprints that are so deep in all these disciplines that speaks to the historicity and the deity of Jesus, because you will not find another fictional or mortal human who's ever had this. He's either just miraculously dumb lucky, right? And you have this anomaly, a singular anomaly in the history of humans, the billions of humans who have lived. Or it might be that he stands outside of that group in some way, that he is who he said he was. Now, interestingly, every case I've ever had in which we have a no body case, I've gotten convictions on all of them. But the juries afterwards, when they were interviewed, would say, I wish, I know he's guilty. And some of these guys have confessed afterwards, but not everyone. But some have. So they were confirmed that they made the right choice. The jury anyway. But the jury would always say, it was good. It was a good case. I think we found him guilty in 4 hours, but I wish we had an eyewitness who would have recorded something on the day of the murder. That would have made it easier. Well, it turns out that we actually have that with Jesus. You don't need it. You'd have enough if you had no eyewitness accounts, but you do. Right. And those eyewitness accounts might give you a clue as to why no other fictional character and no other mortal human has had this kind of impact. Because in those eyewitness accounts, you'll find Jesus making claims to deity, that he was not from this world. He spoke as though he was God, not for God, but as God. He accepted the worship of those who would worship him in a culture that said that was blasphemous. Yeah. He used the I am. He is said to have the power to forgive and create and to judge and to grant eternal life. Only God has those powers. He even said that the angels were his. That claim in the eyewitness account, I think, explains what we're seeing in the fuse and the fallout. And together, that case, I think, is a powerful case that deserves our attention. He's not a person of interest. He's the God of the universe who ought to interest every one of us. Now, the question is, what's keeping us from being interested? A lot of what keeps us from being interested is that we're distracted by other interests. Yeah. And so a lot for young people is that, hey, the culture seems more like it's more fun. I can do what I want. I can make my own rules. I can even use my own terms, make my own definitions, define my own gender. I can do all of this. I'm in complete control. And I'm interested in that life. When in fact, there is the God of the universe who ought to interest us, which we are just turning our back on. So I think that what I'm trying to do in a book like this is get people to pay attention to the gospel. If all of this does not open up an opportunity to preach the gospel, then it's a waste of time. Because in the end, only the gospel changes. My facts don't change it. Investigations like this don't change anything. The gospel changes everything. It fixes every kind of stupid that humans do is fixed by the gospel. So all we're trying to do is get to the gospel. And that's what I'm hoping a book like this does. I want Jesus to be seen as beautiful because that's what he is. And then hopefully the message of the gospel is a little bit easier to communicate.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you. That's a great way to end it. So everybody go get the book, Person of Interest, Why Jesus Still Matters in a World That Rejects the Bible. Grateful to my guest, Jim Warner Wallace, who is an actual detective in real life. So he doesn't just play one on TV.
People probably who knew me at the time said, yeah, on this case, you're playing being a detective. You're lame on this case. But, you know, we have ups and downs. So
no, thank you so much. And I pray that everyone, you know, if you're a skeptic, I pray there's something that will make you just think twice. And if you're a believer, maybe you got another tool in your toolbox to go help to share the gospel, as Jim was saying. So thank you once again. And until next time.